Hi, everyone. I'm Lana Zach. As we've been reporting, Wisconsin held its primary this week despite concerns about the coronavirus. Voters went in person to cast their ballots on Tuesday, but experts say that the stage is now set for legal battles over how to conduct all future elections during the pandemic. 21 states and Washington, D.C. still have primary deadlines between now and July. With the threat of a second wave of infections this fall, Democrats are pushing for alternatives to in-person voting before November's general election. Jessica Levinson is a professor at Loyola Law School, and she joins me now from Los Angeles. Jessica, it's good to be with you again. So tell us, how does what happened in Wisconsin show the ways in which a pandemic can lead to voting rights issues?
Well, what happened in Wisconsin, unfortunately, was a situation where the elected lawmakers did not either do what 15 other states have done, which is to postpone the election or to move it to all vote by mail. So what Wisconsin shows us is that some states will force people to make a decision between their health and their ability to exercise their right to vote, which means Wisconsin shows us that the moment is now for states to act to make sure that they are not in that predicament and don't put voters in that predicament in November.
Well, Jessica, President Trump weighed in on the subject of mail-in voting on Tuesday. I want to play that bite for our viewers.
I think that mail-in voting is a terrible thing. I think if you vote, you should go. And even the concept of early voting is not the greatest because a lot of things happen. But it's okay. But you should go and you should vote. I think you should go and you should vote. You look at what they do, where they grab thousands of mail-in ballots and they dump it. I'll tell you what, and I don't have to tell you, you can look at the statistics. There's a lot of dishonesty going along with mail-in voting.
And now, as we just heard there, the president is arguing that mail-in ballots would be ripe for fraud, even though the president admitted when pressed by reporters that he himself utilized Florida's mail-in option to vote in that primary. So, Jessica, tell us the truth. Is voter fraud a valid reason for stopping states that want to hold mail-in elections?
No. And let me say that again. No. So typically lawyers like me will say, well, on the one hand and on the other hand, and there's a little bit of evidence to indicate. And the answer in this case is no. The fears of voter fraud are so very, very small compared to the fears of disenfranchising people, suppressing the vote, chilling the ability of people getting to the polling place and or weighing in on the election. And so is there voter fraud? It is almost non-existent in the United States. Is there slightly more voter fraud when it comes to mail-in ballots? Yes, there's no question about that. Is it anything near in comparison to the amount of voter suppression that we would see? No. Is there still time for states to put as many safety valves in place when it comes to voter fraud, when it comes to mail-in ballots? Absolutely. This is so irresponsible to hear from the President of the United States, the idea that people should stay home. And I really hope that people do not listen. I hope that state administrators will expand vote by mail.
But Jessica, Republicans have been echoing the president's remarks. What arguments are they making?
So Republicans have made a number of different arguments. The main one that people have latched onto is really voter fraud. And I would encourage people to do exactly what the president encouraged, which is go and look at the statistics. Research any article, any peer-reviewed article that goes through the idea that voting fraud is anything other than a myth, and you will be hard-pressed to find anything. So unfortunately, I think we're in a situation where Democrats are pushing for this because they know that the more people who vote, the better it is for Democrats. Republicans are against this because they know the lower the voter turnout, the better it is for Republicans. And you've actually seen Republicans like President Trump, Senator Mitch McConnell, admit to as much. And it is so distressing to me that this has become a partisan issue on any side. This should be not about using the mechanisms of our elections to try and basically choose your voters or lack of voters.
Well, let's talk about the Wisconsin case. As our Viewers know Democratic Governor Tony Evers tried to stop the primary from going forward as originally scheduled, but Wisconsin's Supreme Court ruled against him. So, Jessica, walk us through that argument, because the courts couldn't have made a partisan argument for why this election needed to go forward as originally scheduled. So what were they saying?
Yeah, so a couple of things to note. Wisconsin's Supreme Court is actually an elected Supreme Court, and one of the members of its Supreme Court it was up in the election that was held yesterday. So it is more of a partisan court, but the argument wasn't partisan. So what they looked at was a separate issue of whether the governor has emergency powers under either the Wisconsin Constitution or Wisconsin statutes to be able on his own through executive order to postpone the election. And they found, and I think correctly, that he did not have that power, that if you want to postpone an election in Wisconsin, you really need the legislature to come with you on that. And so that was not a decision based on how many people they want to vote, although that was the consequence. That was a decision based on how big, basically how broad the governor's power was to try and go this alone in terms of changing an election date.
Well, we know that Governor Evers had tried to get the Republican-led legislature to go along with him, but failing to get that buy-in from the Republican-controlled body, decided to go it alone. So because of that, that's the reason exclusively why the Supreme Court then said this has to go forward as planned. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, so there were two separate suits in that case. There was one suit in the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and the exclusive question there was, does the governor, by executive order, meaning not with the legislature, have the power to postpone the election? And the answer was no. And I think they were on pretty solid ground when it came to that. There was a separate case before the U.S. Supreme Court as to whether or not there was the power in Wisconsin to actually count absentee ballots that came in later. And the U.S. Supreme Court, again, divided on ideological lines, said no. And that hurt tens of thousands of people who had pending vote-by-mail requests in Wisconsin.
Well, that's the perfect segue to the broader question. Other states are looking to move their primaries and expand their mail-in voting options. Virginia Governor Ralph Northam said on Wednesday that he's planning to postpone the state's elections. Do you expect that he and other governors will face similar legal challenges?
Well, so some of this is dependent on each state law. So some states would provide a governor with the either authority or emergency authority to postpone an election. Wisconsin is kind of unique in the sense that it didn't look like that authority was there for the governor, but I don't expect the same legal challenges, in part because Wisconsin is kind of the poster child for how not to manipulate your election laws in order to force people into this terrible choice of basically your health or your vote. Now, it may happen, but thus far, it looks like Wisconsin is an outlier.
Well, I think everyone can agree that democracy and your life and your health shouldn't be in conflict with one another. The key is obviously to create a way for people to vote without endangering anyone's health. But ultimately, who does the burden fall on to solve that problem, and what should be done, Jessica?
Yeah, so ultimately, because our elections in America are obviously dispersed, so it's not the federal government that's in charge of elections by and large. Our Constitution says states get to determine the time, place, and manner of elections, which really means that this is a state-by-state issue. And so what we need to do right now is look at every state and determine, do they have any vote by mail? If the answer is yes, it's time to ramp that up, make it more robust. For instance, if you need an excuse to get a vote by mail ballot, then we should say COVID-19 is a good excuse. If you have to first request that mail-in ballot, it might be time for states to say, you know what, we're just going to send it to you. For other states that don't have any vote by mail, it's time to implement that. It's time to ramp up the infrastructure for that. Get enough paper ballots, get enough machines that can process those ballots. And it's also time, in case we can vote in person, to create a situation where we can physically distance if we vote in person, where there are more early polling places and they're dispersed throughout cities and counties. So people can do basically what they're doing when they go to the grocery store now, which is a few people are let in, they're spaced 6 feet apart. And if you want to vote in person, you can safely, and it doesn't risk the poll workers' lives and it doesn't risk the voters' lives.
Now, as you explained, when you're talking about a state-by-state basis, there's obviously differences that can come into account. But when we're talking about the general election, and a lot of people are starting to keep an eye on what happened in Wisconsin and this entire debate towards November, and in particular with President Trump and some of the things that he was saying, talking about whether a Republican president could ever be elected again if it was all a mail-in ballot. Heaven help us if we're still social distancing in November, but health authorities have said that there's a possibility for a second wave. And frankly, none of us really know how all of this is going to play out. So if in November we're still looking at social distancing and fighting this pandemic, what are the implications for the general election?
Well, so the implications for the the implications for the general election will really be based on what states do now. So if states act not in a few weeks or a few months, but if states act in April to, again, get that vote by mail infrastructure up and running, make sure that they can process those vote by mail ballots, think about where they can space early voting centers throughout the city and county, think about how long they can keep those voting centers open, then we will see minimal disruption. If states decide to wait and to ignore what medical experts have said, unfortunately, I think it's a likely second wave. And then states are going to put their voters in a really untenable position where it may not be safe to go to a polling place. And Wisconsin shows us that we can't rely on the judiciary as a safety valve to make sure that an election is postponed or moved to vote by mail. The other thing is it's much easier, of course, to postpone primary elections, which are set by each state, as opposed to the general election, which is set by Congress. And so you can't have a hodgepodge of basically different requirements for different states in any sort of meaningful way. So the implications will really be determined by what we do now.
Jessica Levinson, always so good to talk to you. I hope other people are listening as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.